Welcome back to the Death and Grief Talk podcast. My name is Joelle Maldonado. I'm also known as the Grave Woman, and I'm your host. One of the most difficult conversations to have is with someone who's thinking about ending their life through suicide. Both for the person being vulnerable enough to share and open up and talk about their emotions and their thoughts, and for the receiving party who's probably shocked and honestly inequipped to deal with or manage or respond to this conversation. I must admit that when preparing for this conversation, a lot of uncomfortable feelings and thoughts came up within me. But I'm so grateful to today's guest, Cait, who has dedicated her life and her work at this point to not only holding space and walking beside those who are considering taking their lives, but also training and educating professionals, family members, and support teams and groups to hold space and the ground for those that are suffering. Before we get into today's conversation, I have to give the disclaimer that neither Cait or myself are licensed or certified mental health professionals. Nothing heard here on this podcast should be considered substitute for mental health or medical advice. If you are someone who is in crisis and need immediate help and support, resources and contact information will be listed in the description below or in the description for this video or podcast. Cait, welcome back. How are you doing? What's been happening? Tell me
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be back. I feel like since the last time we've talked, everything has changed, and it's been a handful of months. So it's amazing to see how time's progressed. But my death practice has actually changed quite a bit since the last time we spoke. And I'm really looking forward to sharing more about that with you today.
Okay. So I've seen on social media where you've been having a lot of discussion about suicide. Can you define what suicide is and tell me about what you're doing in the space of suicide?
Yeah, I have definitely been concentrating on death by suicide. Suicide is when a person decides that they no longer are going to progress with life, and is such a vast topic, just as life, just as death. And we'll probably get into a whole bunch of nuances and intersections as we continue to talk. But suicide is something that affects each and every person directly or indirectly, whether we realize it or not. And they actually say that one death by suicide affects at least 135 people. One death by suicide affects that many people. And that's where we get into like those indirect ways, but it touches so many. So I think it's a really vast conversation, and something because of the significance, the crisis amount of folks walking alongside suicide. We just have to be having these conversations regularly. So thank you for opening this space for us.
No problem. We are approaching the holiday season. And as we in the death care industry know, this is the time of year where a lot of people decide that they no longer want to live for various reasons. But one of the things about suicide that has always been, I don't want to say interesting, but has sparked my curiosity is that there are different types of suicides. There's the egotistic suicide, altruistic suicide, anomic suicide, and fatalistic suicide. Would you be able to shed more lights on those types of suicides and how they affect not only the individual, but those around them in different ways?
Yeah, I mean, suicide and suicidality is such a vast topic. And so I'm speaking to you as a death worker rather than a psychologist or a therapist that has studied it within the clinical spectrum. I actually am coming into the suicide work and practice through community care. And so it's really kind of a different way to approach it as far as education. And therefore, those categorizations are 100% accurate and true. Although, when I'm walking alongside a person that is either passively or actively ideating suicide, I don't often step back and start categorizing them as that. But there is a lot of validity to having those columns and being able to look at a human being at whatever point in life. And I'm even considering and thinking in my mind about our youth, looking at them, seeing their circumstances and their surroundings, their all of their circumstances, and being able to say, okay, because of X, Y, and Z, your trauma, your home, your addictions, you will be more into this category, and therefore should be that's sort of a hint and a clue, if you will, to the people around them. If we took the time and had the knowledge as a society to say, okay, this person's susceptible and at risk, and I can tell that because of XYZ that our psychologists can chart. But we don't often do that. And rather than even get curious, and I love that you use that word, because really, I found myself, after I've had many experiences, personal death by suicides, but after one in particular of my best friend, I really did find myself getting curious to the topic. And I think there needs to be more space reserved for that curiosity, because it's always shut down, it's always taboo and stigmatized. And really, that curiosity, we just want to ask questions and find out more so that we can open it up and look at that human's mind and say, where are you at on the spectrum of life and death, with staying here and being alive or leaving by your choice? And so I do think I personally don't work a lot with those categories, but they have a lot of validity. And I have a book recommendation for listeners that really plays a lot with what you're talking about, that can explain it far better than I can. It's called The Suicidal Mind by Edwin Schneidman. And fantastic book, written from a more clinical spectrum, but very easy to understand for the folks like myself that just want to support people and hold that space open for them.
So, Cait, what does it look like? What is your process for navigating when someone contacts you and says, listen, is it, I don't want to be here anymore. I'm contemplating suicide. I'm having these thoughts that I don't understand. I want to live, but my mind is telling me something different. What is your process? What is the first thing that you do? And how do you advocate for that person seeking the resources that they need? Do you try to convince them not to do what their mind is leading them to do? Do you talk to them? What does that look like?
That's a great question. I'm going to basically describe to you holding space, because that's what I will do when I get that phone call from a person. And that would be whether the person is actively ideating suicide and in immediate crisis. And this is also what I would do if someone's just passively maybe throwing out a statement, I got a lot on my plate, I can't do this anymore. So for both passive and active ideations, I will hold space. And it's really interesting, because I'll explain more about what that looks like in a minute. But on the surface, I think so many people think holding space, oh, just listening to another human being, how significant could that be? Oh, it is so significant to just, first of all, be listened to be seen, and to do that without judgment. I mean, we don't have safe spaces to be actively heard with our pain and our suffering any longer. And oftentimes the spaces that are deemed safe in our communities lead to some sort of repercussion after sharing that. And so there's, then it becomes hesitation to want to just be able to share how you're feeling and the thoughts that are ruminating, because what happens in the mind at that point is, like you said, outside of our conversation, 45, you can't do a podcast for 45 minutes when someone's on the edge of death and choosing to stay alive or not. They don't have time to do that. So what immediately sort of creates some space in that mind for the next thought and some ground to come back in? And really, it's as simple as being listened to. And so when someone calls me and they're like, I'm in crisis, we identify right away, like, is that an active crisis? Are you on that ledge right now with a toe hanging over? Or are you just thinking and toying with these ideas, and life is getting overwhelming and you're feeling it and you need to express it? And so, that's kind of where we start to begin. And either way, though, no matter if it's active or passive, we begin to listen without judgment. And I'll say that, I physically say these things to the person. I'm here without judgment. So whatever you say stays between you and I. There will be no shaming. I will not convince you to stay alive. This is open, fluid space for you, human, to just come on in, sit down, and just like be and express it. And I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to shame you. I'm not going to tell you have to go live. And I'm going to step aside for a minute and share with the audience that's listening. By doing that, by virtue of doing that and just holding that space and listening to the other person, and they're going to be vulnerable and they're going to be sharing some big thoughts, and we watch our ground being under our feet, then be willing to just stay, because that is what saves lives. Mm-hmm. And we're not here to prevent every suicide. That is not what it is. And even suicide prevention will say we're not going to. But it's holding that open space for lifelines to be built all over the place, and they will be.
It's so interesting that you said the words just stay, because a few years ago, I had one of the closest people in the world to me, share with me that at one point in their life, they considered taking their life. And I could not look them in the eye for about 10 minutes. And I have so much guilt around that. But then I also have so much respect for that person for being able to be vulnerable enough in that moment. So as a person who is, maybe someone shared a thought or made a comment, like you said, I just can't do this anymore, which is something we say so casually. But for some people, that is the cry for help. When you hear those thoughts, or when someone says something, or you notice something that just isn't quite right, for lack of a better word, or someone shares the thought with you that I've thought about taking my life, what would you, as someone who works in this space, suggest that person do to be of support and to just stay, to be able to stay, to muster up the courage to stay?
That's a good question. And I just want to honor for a moment what you shared about your experience with your friend, because I really relate to that too. Prior to all of my work in this space, many years ago, just before it all, I too was that way. So many humans are that way naturally, where it's hard to look a person in the eye. It's hard to hear that word. And then for so many families and circles of care, there's religion intersected, there's transgender, all of the spectrum of human existence wrapped and intersected in there. But what I would say to folks is it's really important, if you are going to be holding this space for another person. And sometimes we don't have that warning. Sometimes our friends do just call us up and say, I can't do this anymore, I'm done. And then immediately we do go into that active mode. So one of two things: if you have the time and someone in your life is ideating, give yourself a minute or two to just ground. That is going to be so key in holding this space for another human being. Get yourself a cup of water before you begin. Sit down, maybe, I like to put on some music that kind of helps me balance my frequencies. Maybe you're a person that needs to shake and trampoline and jump. Like, find your thing that's going to help you ground. Do it in a way that can maybe not take 45 minutes, but that you can come into your body and be really ready to be present with another person's pain and suffering. And that is hard because they're being vulnerable. They're expressing deep truths of not wanting to be alive. And so often we are in a society that says, oh, don't say that, or it'll be okay. Like, I hear a lot of people do that when they're holding space. And we're trying to, I see where it comes from, where you're wanting to just get the person over that hump, if you will. You know, it'll get better tomorrow. Just keep trying. And you know what? Those things really aren't helpful in that moment. It's about just bearing witness, being able to sit in that darkness, if you will, that vastness, in the groundlessness with another person. And so it's going to be on you as the sitter to find the ground. And so I do grounding before I go into this space. I do it at the end of this space. And I actually have some techniques that I would share with anyone in the world who ever wanted them. But really, I rely a lot on affirmations and like mental words to keep me grounded during that time as well. And that's not to say I lose my focus with the other person, but maybe I just notice my mind starting to slip away from whatever they're saying, or wanting to recoil, or getting a little nervous that they just shared they're done here on earth living. And I might just say my affirmation and it brings me back into my body so I can sit there and be with them, and I can just let them continue to be heard. So, great question. Grounding, I think, is really key.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is that from the perspective of someone who has been chosen as the vessel for, it's important to just listen, to stay, and to just hold the ground. I love that wording, hold the ground, and just be open. Now, from the perspective of the person that's being vulnerable, the person that doesn't want to be alive anymore, what do you say to them?
It's interesting because it's less about words, and that you have a very valid question, and that's what everyone wants to know. Like, what do I say to them? How do we wrap up this conversation, if we will? You know, how does anything like that end in a way? And I let the person that's sharing just continue until they're done. And it's almost, I've had this happen every time, where it's this natural breath that just comes in. Some space is what I call it. And you'll hear it in their voice, where now they say, okay, I'm going to go out and walk my dog, and I'm going to go get myself a drink of water, and I'm feeling the ground back under my feet, or I'm going to go schedule a therapy appointment and I'm headed there, or I'm about to go call my so-and-so, and I'm going to, you know, so it's like those plans for the next moment is always really valuable to hear. But yeah, I think it is different for each person, truly.
Okay. So as you said a few moments ago, you don't try to convince anyone to still be alive, and you can't prevent or help everyone in their moment of outcry, right? How do you release any guilt or release feelings of confusion or anger or frustration or bitterness around not being able to do that, and cope with the fact internally that this person reached out and they still ended their life? And not just you, this is for families, this is for professionals, this is for friends, coworkers. How do you do that?
Ultimately, what I hear in my mind right now to share is that death is the teacher here. So it's constant practice of letting go and surrendering to letting go. And that is incredibly difficult to do when you're walking alongside someone that is ideating, actively suicidal, and then carries out a suicide. You know, just backing up to holding that space and grounding for a person and having it come to this moment here. I'm walking alongside someone right now who's holding space for someone. And this caregiver is having to be very mindful themselves of holding that ground under their feet. So I would love in a perfect world to equip everyone with suicide education and prevention and have us carry it on our hips like Narcan, if you will, where everyone is educated on this harm reduction product. But I do feel like there's just going to be some people that do have a difficult time sitting in that vastness. So it comes down to looking at yourself and seeing where you're at personally and saying, am I a candidate right now to hold space for another human being? And if I'm not, no, surrender and let go and practice that. Try not to feel the shame, try not to feel the guilt. And these are just words. I'm a human. I feel the shame and guilt myself, but it's a practice. And this is where death, the teacher, comes in of letting it go again and again and again. Oh, this life, it just is continual practice. And so, I think I don't want to glorify it in any way, but there is this delicate balance of seeing death as the teacher and continually practicing letting go. And so that could look like, expressing in activities too. We don't want this to just be done in silence. So it's going to be important for a person to express themselves. Maybe you keep a journal and a notebook and you brain dump those feelings and those thoughts, but keeping within our own bodies because we are basically walking in the trenches.
That's a really good answer. So one last question about this, and then we're going to segue into an issue that gets a little bit conflated, for lack of a better word. But is it intrusive as someone who holds space and who's been the trusted person to then reach out to a mental health professional on behalf of that other person, with or without their consent, to say, I know someone who's struggling in this moment, or ideating, which is a word you've used several times in this moment, which I interpret as just tossing these thoughts back and forth in your mind? Correct me if I'm wrong, please, but is it intrusive to reach out on behalf of that person to seek help for them?
I always like to ask for consent if able to first, 110%. And we do always hold space for folks that don't aspire to living, but that doesn't mean that we don't try like hell in every way to get the resources and the interventions in place for this person. So 100%. If they're not able to give consent for one reason or another, I often find, it will be me doing a Google search for a resource, or me, bouncing an idea off a colleague. Ultimately, though, consent is key. But there are a lot of resources in place that I would want to, get some feedback. We're not supposed to do this thing alone, and especially as a space holder for someone that is actively or just passively contemplating suicide. For the person that's holding that space, the doula, the doctor, the regular human civilian, the parent, whoever you are, you can do it. And I really think I'll just end on that. You have that ability.
Okay. So what about medical aid in dying? I shared with you a few moments ago that I sit on the board of directors for an organization called Compassion and Choices, which is advocating legally, financially, and with so many resources for those that are suffering. And part of that journey for me was really checking in with myself and asking the question, am I advocating for suicide, or am I advocating to end suffering for individuals that are just simply not going to get better? And a part of that answer in my soul, the part of the yes in my soul, was that my uncle Mark, was an alcoholic for the majority of his life. And it is my belief that he chose to die in Colorado so that he could take advantage of the medical aid in dying laws there. I can't prove that, but it's what I feel in my soul. And so as a person who works so hard to advocate for support and support professionals supporting or walking alongside, as you so beautifully say, those that no longer have the desire to live, how does the conversation of medical aid in dying, in your opinion, differ from conversations about suicide?
I'm so glad that we brought this into conversation. And I think it's going to be up to each of us as deaf workers and deaf educators to continue to have these conversations. A person comes to mind as we're talking that I knew who was in his 80s and was suffering with terminal cancer, incurable cancer, was told he had 6 months or less to live by the doctors. And in Maine, medical aid in dying is now legal, but at the time it was not. And I met with him one week, and I actually at the time was cutting his hair, and so I cut his hair. And a week later, he took a gun to his head and died by suicide. And I just, he'll always leave an imprint in my heart, because it's like, that was something, that suicide right there, that trauma of his wife having to now come in and see her 80-year-old husband sprawled out on the living room floor, his daughter, who was a caretaker in college down the road, coming home and hearing her mother's screams. All of that could have been completely avoided had medical aid in dying been legal in our state at the time. And the two suicide and medical aid in dying get intersected all the time. And I think that's because for so long, medical aid in dying was called, what was it? Physicians assisted suicide, like it's euthanasia. It's had a lot of these words that have a lot of connotation and a lot of stigma to them as it stands anyway. And these conversations that we're having are a bit radical in the spectrum of life and death. Suicide in history's past has always just happened, and it's been a thing, and it was written on the death certificate and shuffled under. And now we're having conversations about why, who, intervention. And so, yeah, I really see that these conversations are important to distinguish the difference between the two, because suicide is a choice that happens at a different point with a different type of mental anguish and suffering than does, medical aid in dying in any degree. Medical aid in dying is, they're separate, but they get intersected all of the time. The language and the feelings that people on the outside bring into it. Now, anyone that's walked in this space and had someone that's either obtained medical aid in dying or died by suicide that should have been able to obtain the medication will say this is not suicide even in the least bit. And I think their stories are important too, because suicide has a stigma attached to it still. And they're like, this was my parent, this was my family member that was suffering medically, chronically for so long. And just trying to keep that verbiage separate.
I agree. And during that time of searching, my mom asked me, she's like, so what's the difference? Just because a doctor has told someone that they're sick and they have this long to live, what is the difference between a person and in their mind and their heart and their soul is being told the same thing, but it's not from a doctor? And that really, even now it sits with me. It's not that I question my work, but it really forces me to check in with my intention. And so I guess what I'm saying is that we don't have the answer to that, really.
Yeah, and that
makes it so difficult.
And neither do the professionals, the medical team systems, And so I think that does show the crisis level too, like the amount right now as to how many folks are considering suicide. And so these are good conversations to be having, because they're needing to happen between people like you and I, regular folks, if you will.
Yeah. Well, Cait, you have tons of amazing resources. Can you tell everyone where they can find you, whether you're professional, whether you're someone who's actively ideating taking your life or ending your life, or whether someone just wants to have more information? Where can they find out about you, your work, and take advantage of the resources that you have?
Thank you for asking. Anyone that would like to find out more, please go over to deathbysuicideawarecare.com. And that's aware care. Yeah, that's the website that I'm at now. And that has a page full of free resources, so that's a wonderful place to start. I also have a store on that. And right now in the store, there's 2 freebies. One being how to hold space for suicide talk. And this is something that I've had many different people in the medical spectrum, the clinical spectrum, reach out and say, hey, I've used this on my patients who are suicidal, and your download's phenomenal, Cait. So please go grab that if you're listening. It's free. My Instagram, of course, which is at cait.deatheducation, is also a hugely great place to get all of this information and education specifically about suicide. I will say I have been under extreme censorship, or what I consider extreme censorship, from Instagram since consistently posting about this topic. And I think that's interesting. I've been on the platform 4 years sharing death education and death information, and only within the time frame where I've been sharing specifically about suicide have I gotten several violations. So I think that to me is really interesting and really reflects our society that we live in, and the desire to keep the silence and the secrecy around something that is very stigmatized. But it's a great place in the meantime. And I would also invite anyone that's listening to, while you're on my website, check out the Aware Care group. And that's something I recently started. And that is a monthly walk along where we have groups every month where we get together. And these groups consist of people in and outside of the clinical spectrum, as well as folks that are walking alongside their own ideations. So it's like this wonderful melting community of just different human beings that have walked every aspect of suicide. And we also have a lot of resources that come through that group as well. So I would invite you to take a look at that.
Thank you so much for your time and for holding this space and this ground, Cait. I appreciate you, and thank you for everything that you're doing.
Thank you so much, Joelle, and thank you for everything you're doing too. Together is how we will get to a sustainable tomorrow. So I'm grateful for that.
Thank you guys so much for listening. Live life, love hard. We'll talk to you next time. Thank you so much for listening. To learn more about our courses, workshops, books, and how you can support The Grave Woman, visit www.thegravewoman.com.